This video will be a wrap-up of the rig that we've made, and there's some neat features that we're going to add. But before we do that, our rig is essentially finished. This is capable of being handed off to an animator and used in production. But handing it off to an animator is actually one of the things that we should be doing at this point. After we've gone through and made sure that all of our nodes are named correctly and all of the display things work correctly, we really should be testing this by having it used by an animator. Because while this rig functions completely, it may not do what our animation requires. We'll have to do kind of an iterative loop. An animator will test the rig, make some decisions about how it moves, things like that, then back to the rigging department or to you, and you'll have to go in and make adjustments in order to give the animators what they want. So assuming that that's going on, if you're the animator, that you're making these decisions as you're going, some of the things that we want to watch out for have to do with Houdini and how it operates. So I've gone through and I've made sure that all of the nodes are named correctly and that everything actually works as I expect it to. But there are some things that might jump up at you. And one of those things is something called Autoscope. So by default, all of the nodes in Houdini have a series of parameters, and those parameters have something called Autoscope. And if you go to a node and you right-click, let's say, a translate, then you go to Channels and Keyframes, and then you go right down to the bottom, you'll see two options, Set Autoscope and Unset Autoscope. Right now, Autoscope is set, so I'm able to unset it. And if I unset it, then I'll be able to set it again. But what is this, and what does it do? Right now, if I select this node, and in the viewport, I just use the K key, that will key all of the parameters that have Autoscope set. So you can see that I've keyed Translate, Rotate, and Scale, but not Pivot Translate, Pivot Rotate, or Uniform Scale, or indeed any of these other parameters. That's because Autoscope is turned off for all of these. And I can show you that. If I undo, right-click on the Translate parameter, Channels and Keyframes, unset Autoscope, and nothing changes. But if I select that node and hit K in the viewport, you can see that only Rotate and Scale have been keyed. So Translate's been removed from that autoscoping functionality. So I will have to manually key it if I want it to be keyed. So there are some things in our rig, specifically some of the parameters that we've made. Oftentimes it's these space switching parameters and our IK-FK blend parameters that will have Autoscope turned off by default. So we actually want to turn those on. And the way that we do that is through the type properties. So if we open our type properties, you can see all of our parameters that we've created. Many of these parameters we've created from nodes already existing in our scene. So we have a null that we're using as a control object. It has Translate, Rotate, and Scale that have Autoscope set already. And so when we grab this parameter and we drag it up into the type properties, this parameter will inherit that Autoscope setting. But most of the parameters that we've created by hand, especially these display parameters, will not have Autoscope on. And the way to find that is if you select a parameter, go to Channels, and then you can see each of these linked channels, sort of lines here, with the default is this guy right here that looks like a little graph. If you hover over that, you'll see it says Autoscope. So right now, this master display will not be keyed if I hit K in the viewport. And these display parameters, we don't want these to be keyed ever, really. They're just display parameters. So we'll leave these Autoscopes set to off. But some things, like for instance, this master translate, this was a parameter that we dragged up from a null. So this one has Translate X, Y, and Z. It has Autoscope on. So what we want to do is we want to go through this entire list. And again, most of these we don't have to really look at because they've been inherited from nulls. But many of them that we built ourselves, we do want to check to see that this Autoscope is turned on. And the ones that you need to look at in particular, you can see all of these spine ones. If I just go through, you can see that they all have Autoscope set. So that's fine. But the ones we want to definitely check are things like on the arms and legs, these space switching parameters, these are ones that we made ourselves, and they're not set to Autoscope. And in fact, this left arm FK-IK blend is not set to Autoscope. But that's definitely something that we want the animators to be able to key just by hitting a K key. So for these, I'm going to turn Autoscope on. And then I'm going to do that for the right arm as well. And then these automatic controls that we have for our shoulder, clavicle, and scapula, I think that I want these to be keyable as well. So we can see that that one's already keyable. Clavicle, already Autoscope is on. Scapula blend is not. So I'm going to turn that one on. So you'll want to go through and just double check. So especially these space switching parameters, any IK, FK blending parameters, and then these auto parameters, just make sure that they have this Autoscope set to on. So I'm going to go through the rest of this. And as I say, a lot of these we've dragged up from null. So they will have inherited that Autoscope already. A big chunk that we definitely have to check are all of the foot roll parameters, because we made these by hand. So none of these will have Autoscope on. So we'll have to turn that on for all of these. So I'm going to do that and then come back and we'll continue. I've gone through and set Autoscope on all the things that needed to be set. Just as a little reminder, all of these hand control parameters that we built, all of those needed to be Autoscoped as well. So just do a sweep, and if you miss something and then later find that something isn't keying when you're trying to key it, just remember that that's something to check, is that Autoscope setting. Another thing that we might want to do, in a minute we're going to do something called invisible rigs, which is fairly fun, but something else that will help us remove some of these control objects that are a little bit distracting. For instance, we might be using this character to block out a shot, and we don't really need to see all of these finger controls. So what we can do is create another category, I guess you could say. So right now we have, for the left hand, we have a geo display, bone display, and a controls display. And the controls display has a menu basically just on-off. But what we can do is we can add a third option, and we can say detail, for instance. I'm going to hit apply, accept. So now our left-hand controls display can be off, on. Now we have this new detail. So when it's off, we obviously just get this arm wrist control. And when it's on, we get this hand rotate as well as all the fingers. But what if we just want to see this hand rotate and not all of the fingers? Well, what we can do is use that detail option. Instead of on, these finger controls are only on when detail is chosen. So let's say we want this hand bone control, render, display. So we can say if left hand control display is greater than 0, then this control should be on, otherwise off. So now if we turn it off, the hand rotation turns off. If it's on, the hand rotation turns on. And if it's on detail, the hand rotation stays on. But we can use this detail to drive these individual finger controls. So the metacarpal controls, thumb. So I'm grabbing all of these finger control objects, and now in their render tab, display. So if left hand display is greater than 1, so now off, all the hand control objects are off. On, just that hand rotate is on. And now if I want to see my fingers, I can change that to detail, and then they pop on. So that's a nice way of having a limited set of controls on without having all that distraction. If you're far away and you're trying to grab that hand control, you have all these little finger controls in the way. It can be really cluttered. So that's one way of doing it. I'll show you another way in a minute. But for now, I'm going to do the same to the right-hand side, and I'll come right back. Another way of having a little more control over the display of our control objects is to use these master display options. And we haven't really used these at all, except for turning on and off this master control here. But we can use these geo, bone, and control display to sort of override all of these other ones. as an example, this head control lives here on this head neck tab. So our control display, I can turn it off and turn it on. But sometimes you want to be able to just turn everything off really quickly, or turn everything back on, or back to its original state. So we can use this master control display in addition to whatever is currently controlling it. So this head control is being controlled by the head control display, HC display parameter. But we can also control it with this master display, and that one is just called C display. So what we can do is we can just copy that. I'm going to say if the head control display and that's 2 ampersands. So if head control display and C display, which is our master controls display parameter name. So if head control display and master control display equal 1, then 1, otherwise 0. So if the master display control display is on and the head control display control is on, then this guy can be on. But let's say I'm way over here and I want to turn off that control display. So I can do it from the head neck by doing that, but that turns off everything else as well. But now I can go over to the master control display and that will turn that one off. So what I'm going to do is all of these head controls, instead of just being controlled by the head control display, are going to be controlled by both the head control display and the master control display. So that way I can, just with one parameter, I can turn off the entire head control or turn it on back on again. And that'll allow me to very quickly use just one parameter to turn off all of my controls or turn them back on again. So I'm going to do that and I'll come back. I've gone through and added control over the controls from the master display parameter, but I've also done the same for the bones and for the proxy geometry. So no matter what the spine, head, neck, arm, leg parameters say, I can control them from this master display. So if I wanted to very quickly turn off all the controls, I could come to the master display, off. You can see all of the controls are off. Turn them all back to whatever their individual parameters are set to by going on. Same with bones. Currently the master display for bones is off, but each of the components have the bone display on, and yet we're not seeing any bones. But I can come to the bone display, turn that on. And that's simply by adjusting these scripts, these little expressions. So if, in this case, the left foot geometry display is 1, then 1, and G display, which is the master geometry display. So many ways in which you can control the visibility of geometry, of controls, of bones, and we'll look into another one a little bit later on. Throughout this series, I've mentioned having the proxy be locked into this object isn't really the best way to do it. What we'd like to do is use a file SOP, and the file SOP will allow us a great deal more flexibility because we can call a piece of geometry from just about anywhere we want. We can call it from within the HDA itself by accessing the extra files, or we can go straight to a place on disk or on our network somewhere. And it's much easier to then change that destination, that target, and then this one will update automatically. Whereas in this situation, this geometry is literally locked into this node. And so we would have to come in and manually change it every time. So because we have lots of proxy objects, it's a real pain to have to go through and do this by hand. So once again, a little shelf tool will come to our rescue, and it'll be provided with this video, and it's called Inject Proxy. So again, just go to your Houdini 16.5 or whatever version you're using into the toolbar folder and drop that Inject Proxy into that folder. And you'll have to restart Houdini in order for Houdini to be able to pick that up. And then on our rigging shelf, just right-click, Edit Shelf tab, then go to the Tools section, and then just come down and just find Inject Proxy and then add it to that shelf. So let's have a quick look at what this tool is going to do. If I right-click and edit the tool, go to its script tab, you can see, again, it's reasonably simple, just doing a couple of things, but it's going to do it in a loop over all of the selected nodes. And what we're going to do is select our proxies, and then it'll run this script over each of those individually. So what are we doing here? Well, we're going to get the selected nodes, put that into a variable called objList, and then we want to get the definition of our HDA. We want to get this guy. And so we're going to take the first thing in that list. I'm going to find its parent, which is the HDA itself. I'm going to get its type and definition. I'm going to put that into HDA definition. And then for each of these nodes that we've selected, we're going to get its name. We're going to create a section name using that name. So that name plus bgeo, in this case, Houdini's default geometry format. And then we're going to go into the node and create a variable called dsop, so display sop. So node display node. What that will do is the operator that has the display flag will be placed into this variable. And then we're going to get the data in the geometry of that node and put that into section. And then once we have all of these, we're going to use HDA definition. We're going to add the add section method. Takes a section name, which we've created, and the section, which we've also created from the data, and we're going to add it to the definition. And then we're going to look through here, and if the display sop is hard locked, which is this red flag, then we're going to destroy that node. So if it's locked, delete it. And then what we're going to do is create a file node. We're going to use that node name again with _file, and then we're going to do that here. So we're going to create a file node, and then in this parameter, the file parameter, we're going to fill it with this little line here. So it's opdef, which means operator definition, and then this little relative path, and then the section name. So that's going to loop through all of the objects that we select and perform this operation. So it's going to take the geometry from here, it's going to add it to our HDA, then it's going to put a file node down and point to that geometry that we just added. And then additionally, I've added this just more as a convenience. We're going to use a Autoscope sop to create an attribute. I can show you that like this. So the result of this script is going to be this. It's going to be a file node pointing to the section that we just created, and then a Autoscope sop, which is going to create this attribute called Autoscope. And once we're done, we're going to come back and use this Autoscope to create what we're calling invisible rigs. I'll just close this, get rid of that. And invisible rigs will allow us to turn off all of our controls and animate just with our geometry. And I'll show you how that works later. So we have our Inject Proxy script. And just to be sure, we're going to right-click on our HDA and say Save Node Type. And then we're going to save our file, just in case this whole thing explodes. And we're going to grab all of our proxy geometry. And since our proxy geometry has its selectability flag turned off, I can't select in the viewport. So I have to go into the network and do it. So I've got all of my proxy objects selected. And now I'm going to simply click Inject Proxy. And it's going to run for a few seconds as it iterates through all of those nodes, and it looks like it's done. So now if I right-click on my soldier and I go to his type properties, and I go to this Extra Files tab, you can see that we've added all these BGOs. So these are all of our proxy objects. And accept. And now if I go inside, you can see that we still have our object merge, because this is handy to keep around, just in case we need to make an adjustment. But now we have this file node, and its name is the object that it's contained in, so left-hand dist proxy 0, so that's the proxy geometry node name, _file. And then its file parameter has this opdef relative path to that geo. So if you want to see how this is constructed, I can manually do this again. So here's a file node. And when I go to navigate to find a piece of geometry, instead of using my disk drive, I can come here to this thing that says opdef. So that's operator definitions. And it's going to list all of Houdini's operator definitions. So all the HDAs that Houdini comes with. So you can see there's chops and vops and particles, all kinds of stuff. But what we want in this case, because our soldier is an object, I'm going to go into the object directory. And you can see all of these HDA definitions that are there. So we've got, mocap stuff, and there's some third-party stuff from Pixar. And here we are, soldier version 1. So I can go into the soldier, and now this lists all of the extra files, all of those sections. And if I turn off show sequences, you can see that here are all the proxy geometries that we've added. So now I can select one of these, hit accept, and now there it is. And when I save this, if I hit accept, now this proxy geometry is being pulled in right from the HDA. And then to make this a relative path, I can just edit this to be, oops, did I do it wrong? Oh, it doesn't like this. There we go. So you can see how making a script to do it for you avoids those little mistakes. But that's how you would navigate there manually. So we've done this for all of our proxies, and that's great. It saved us a huge amount of time. But what I did forget to do, if you'll remember, Control-click to create that pose scope SOP. So I forgot to use Control-click. So all I have to do is I can just undo out of this, and I'll just do this again, and I'll show you how the pose scope works. All right, I did undo a couple times and reran our Inject Proxy script, but this time I held down Control. So if I hold down Control, it will create this pose scope node. And so now I have this file, which is reading the section. And then I'm creating an attribute called pose scope. If I middle click on this node, you'll see that I now have a primitive attribute called pose scope. So what we want to be able to do is animate our rig without seeing any of these controls, or maybe just fewer controls, depending on what we want. As an example, we'll just use the head. So I'm going to go to our head control. I should go and turn those parameters back on. So I have this head control, and I can rotate the head. But if I want to rotate the head without that control there, I can use the pose scope that's on this head proxy. So I can go inside. So here's our geometry. Here's that pose scope. And what the pose scope wants is it wants a group, a primitive group. But in this case, if it's blank, it will just use all of the incoming geometry. And in this case, all of this is fine. So pose scope, a group, or all the geometry. And then I can specify some channels, or I can use a pick script, and I'll show you that in a second. But for now, if I go to channels, and I use a channel chooser, it will open up my scene, and I can navigate through to soldier. And what I want to find are the channels on head bone 1 control. I want to grab this rotate. So I'm going to go and find, where is it? So head bone 1 control. So if I click on it, it'll open up. And then I can see all of the available channels on head bone 1 control. So I'm going to go down to rotate X, Y, Z. And just click and drag to select multiple channels. Export relative path. And now I can hit accept. So now if I go back into my head proxy, and on my pose scope, I can see that the channels have been filled in with head bone 1 control RX, RY, and RZ. So what that means is that if I use the pose tool, which is distinct from, if you come over here and you can see this is the move tool, the rotate tool, scale tool, and then just below it, the little guy looks like he's hanging by his fingernails. This is the pose tool. So if I use the pose tool, and the hotkey for that is Control R, you can see that I get this use surface region controllers, parameters called stealth pick. What that means is if I have this turned on, and if the geometry that contains my pose scope attribute has its selectability turned off, what it means is that in the pose tool, if I mouse over, you can see that it highlights blue. But if my geometry has its selectability on, this overrides that pose scope functionality. So if the selectability of this head proxy is on, I just get the normal highlight from the selection. But if the selectability is off, and I'm in the pose state, now I get this blue. So what does this blue mean? Well, it means that if I click on this geometry, it will transfer that click from this geometry to the controls that we had specified in the channels. So let's see how that works. If I go into pose, and now I click and drag, I'm rotating the head, all in one motion. So that means that I can turn off my parameters. I can be way over here. And let's say I just want him to move his head just a little bit. So I can animate his head without seeing any controls and being pretty far away. So that's super useful. And you can do this with multiple controls. An obvious one is down here for our hand. Turn those parameters back on. So right now, when we're in the IK state, we can translate our IK wrist, and that will bring our hand along with it. And then we can select this one and rotate the hand itself. But we might want something a little more convenient. So what we can do is, so here's that hand bone proxy, which might be something nice that we can click and drag on this and translate or rotate. So we can go into its pose scope. This control, which is the hand bone control, we want its rotations, but we also want left arm bone goal controls translates. And we can add both of those into this proxy geometry's pose scope. So again, we navigate to our soldier. So left arm bone control. So left arm bone goal control. And we want translate. But we also want left hand bone control. I can open that up. And I want the rotates. Oops, I should hold control and add these to the selection. So translations and rotations, export relative path, and hit accept. Then we'll go and make sure that this hand bone proxy's selectability is off. And we turn off our controls. When I go into the pose state and I mouse over that hand, it turns blue. So now this is kind of an interesting thing. The pose scope has two very different sets of channels. It has a rotate set and a translate set. So if I click and drag on this, I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to choose one of them. It might have to do with the order. So pose scope, click and drag. So yeah, it's translating the IK wrist. And I think that, yeah. So that was in there first. We look at this big list of channels. So we have the IK translates, and then we have the hand rotates. So if I wanted to reverse that, I could just rearrange the order of these. So how do I get to those rotates? If this is translating, how do I get to my rotates? Well, the way to do that is to not click and drag, but just click. And you can see that I've got a radial menu pops up. And so I can see that I have translate as a choice, but I also now have rotate. So I can go up to rotate and choose that. And now I have this rotational ability. And when I do this, I'll see this handle appear. But if I don't want to see that, I can just click off. And now the pose scope will remember what my last kind of choice was. So now if I click and drag, it's still rotating, but I don't have to see that handle there. So I can rotate, and then if I want to go back to translate, I just click, go over to translate, and I get that jack. And there we go. So I can pop between these two really quickly, and I'm not distracted by any of my controls. So this is a pretty cool feature, and once you've set it up, and you can set it up as much or as little as you want. You may want to leave all of the spine controls to be active and not use pose scope on the spine, or just use it on the spine and not the arms. You can choose to do whatever you want because you have that kind of complete control. And again, you can overload these things. You can have multiple types of controls, and the pose scope will automatically create this radial menu for you. So you could have, dozens of different things going on in here, depending on what you want. And again, you just add them with the Choose Channels dialog, and they go right into there. And if you didn't want all of this geometry to be active, like right now, this entire piece of geometry is active. What if you just wanted a small section here at the top of the palm? Because this is looking for a group, you could just make a group. And again, that's a primitive group. So we can say, how about just these? Accept that selection. So now I have a group called group 1. Attach that to pose scope. And now instead of a blank parameter, I can say use group 1. So now when I go up and into the pose state, I don't get a highlight until I've gone over just those polygons that are in that group. So now I can use it, but I can't click anywhere here. So there we go. That's invisible rigs. So the key points to remember are that you're using the pose scope SOP with a group, or if you wanted the entire geometry, you could leave that group field blank. And then you're going to navigate and choose the channels that you want. And then the object itself that contains the pose scope has to have its selectability turned off. And there you go. So in addition to using the pose scope to specify specific channels, you can also use a pick script. So if I open that up, I'll get a place where I can put a little label. So I can say hello. And then I can choose a language, either HScript or Python. And then I can make a little script. So now, if I go up and I go into the pose tool and I click on this head, oh, wait a minute. There we go. So for pose scope, you either do channels or a pick script. So not both. So pose, click, and that brought up that little message box because that was the script that I wrote. But clearly, either in HScript and certainly Python, you could do really, really complex things here that could be run anytime you click on a piece of geometry that has that attribute. Another very cool feature of the pose scope. Another way of using scripts with our rig is to place them inside the scripts section of our HDA. And here I've added one already called onCreated. And this onCreated is one of the very special ones we call events. If you look down here in the event handler, you can see that I've created one called onCreated. But you can use onLoad, onUpdated, onDeleted. So these are some very, very common things that are done to HDAs. And so we've provided this little list to listen for events in Houdini. And so when one of these events occurs, we can then run a script associated with that event. So in this case, I've used onCreated. And in Python, make sure that whenever you create a script here in your HDA, that you pay attention to the type of script it is. You want to make sure that it's either an HScript, HScript expressions, or in this case, it's Python. So I need to change this to Python. Otherwise, this won't work. So I'm going to change that to Python. And now this Python code is valid. And the KWArgs has a notion of what the node is, the name of the node. So KWArgs node dot set selectable in viewport 0. So turn off selectability in the viewport when this node is created. So I can hit accept. And now if I hide that guy for a second, just save it just in case. And now when I create a new one, a new instance of this asset, soldier, it gets created, but its selectability is off, which is usually what you want for HDAs, especially character HDAs. So that's one useful script. Another script that we can do is to set all of our parameters back to their defaults. So if you've gone through and animated and made some changes, and instead of having to go through each of these and set all of these back to their defaults, we can put a script over here on our master tab in the actions folder. And so that's why we have that actions folder in all of these, is because we're going to put some scripts in there. So we can put a script in master actions called SetAllToDefaults. And what it will do is it'll go through all of these parameters and set each and every one of them back to their defaults so that we can get back to this state really, really quickly. So we'll do that, and then we'll make another one called setKey that we can put inside each of these sections. So we can go to the right arm, and inside of its actions folder, there'll be a button called setKey, and it'll set a key just on the arm. And then we can put one in the hand. So if we click that one, it'll set a key just on the hand. And then a master one that'll set a key on everything. There's tons of things you can do, but we'll do those two just to give you a good indication of how to do that and what's possible. To begin making our animation scripts, we're first going to make a button inside of our master actions folder. So I'm going to grab a button, throw it in there. I'm going to call this SetAllToDefault, and I give it a label, SetAllToDefault. And then to use this button, if I hit apply right now, I'll get a button called SetAllToDefault inside my actions folder. You can press that, nothing happens. So where the action really happens is this callback script. So when I press this button, I want to run this script. And just like when we made our onCreated script, it was very important that we pick the proper language, in this case Python. The same is true here in the callback script. And you can see that it has a little icon at the end, a little H. That means H script. But we want to use Python. This is very, very important. If you find that you're making buttons and things like that that run scripts and that they're not running at all, double check this for sure, because I find I make this mistake a lot. And it's often that I've forgotten to set this to the proper language. But if you go into Edit, Preferences, Scripting, I think, you can change the default expression language. So right now, my default is HScript, but I could change it to Python. And if I did that, then when I brought this window up or I create a new parameter, this would be set to Python by default. So depending on what language you use most of the time or what you're most comfortable with, you can make that change there. We could put a little valid piece of Python in here that would run whenever we hit this button. But obviously this area is a little bit small and it's a little awkward to use for anything more than maybe one line. So instead, we're going to use our scripts section in the HDA to create a Python module. And then I can apply that. So now I have this Python module. And this is the same as if you were writing a command line tool or something, and you import some third-party library like NumPy or something. So essentially, we've created a module and we're automatically importing it into our HDA. So now, in our parameter on our callback, we can write something like who_pwd means the current working directory, which is this HDA, and then go to the HDA module, and this HDA module is this Python module, and then run whatever is there. And in this case, we're going to run SetAllToDefault, so this method. And we're going to pass in the kwargs, because the kwargs knows about this node. It knows its name, it knows its type, so we can get access to that information if we need it. So present working directory, Python module, and then the function. So now we need to write that function. I have some pre-written code. So here is our function, SetAllToDefault, and it takes in kwargs. And what I'm doing here is on the master SetAllToDefault, what that's actually going to do is run this little function. And what this little function is going to do is it's going to go through and find all of the buttons that we make in our actions folder, and it's going to press them. So when I say SetAllToDefault, what that's really going to do is it's going to go to the master folder and find the button that we're going to call SetMasterToDefault, and it's going to press it. Then it's going to go to the spine, find the action folder and look for a button called Set Spine to Default, and it's going to press that button, etc. So I think I have two examples here. So here's when it runs, it's going to create a variable called master button. And using the kwargs of the node, it's going to find the parameter called Set Master to Default, and then it's going to press that button. And when this button is pressed, it's going to run this chunk of code. It's going to run Set Folder to Default. And then Set Folder to Default is going to do all of the work. And we'll go through that in a second. But first, to see how this works, when we go to Set Folder to Default, we'll go here and in our actions, so we have a Set All to Default. We'll make another button. Maybe we'll separate those. And this one is going to be called Set Master to Default. And then the script that it's going to run, just copying and pasting here, is not Set All to Default, but Set Folder to Default. I can get a little more room here. And then again, I'm going to change this from HScript to Python. So let's go through the logic of that again. When the Set All to Default button is pressed, apply that. If I hit Set Master, it's just going to reset these to default. Then it's going to run Set All to Default here, which is going to look for the master button, and it's going to press it. And then it's going to look for all the other buttons that we're going to make and press those. But if I just want to set master to default, Set Master to Default is going to run the actual Set Folder to Default. And so if we look at what that is, Set Folder to Default here in our scripts, the help says Set All Parameters to Default. So what do we need to do? When we run this, we need to find out where we are and what subset of parameters, because we have lots of parameters here. But when we run Set Master to Default, we just want to set these ones. So an easy way to do that is to find out where this button is in our interface. And so we have a button parameter template, which is this actual parameter. And then we can find out the folder that contains this parameter using containing folder. And then we can find out the parent of that folder by using its containing folder. So what we're doing is we're finding this parameter, finding the folder that contains this parameter, which is actions. And then we're finding the folder that contains actions, which in this case is master. So once we have that, we can find all of the parameter templates that are in this folder. We put that in a variable. And then we make an empty list. And then we go through each of these parameter templates and we find out whether they are an individual parameter like these fellas, or whether they're a folder like display, controls, and actions. And if they're a folder, we're going to run parms from folder, which is a little function that I wrote that goes inside that folder and finds its parameters. And it finds them, adds them to the parameter list. But if the parameter template isn't a folder, then it just adds it to that parameter list. So this little chunk of code is just creating a list of parameters that are not folders. And then once we have that list, we can loop through it, get the parameter tuple, and then revert it to default. So it seems a little confusing because the names are often repeated and there's parm templates and parm folders and all of that kind of stuff. But if you just walk through the logic of it, it's really quite simple. We find out what button we've pressed and where it is, and then we find all of the parameters, add them to a list, but if that parameter is a folder, then we find the parameters in that folder and add those to the list. And once we have the list, we just loop through them and set them to default. So I'm going to comment that out because we haven't made that button yet. Now if we test this, so the master scale, I'm going to scale him up to 6.3. And I'm going to say Set Master to Default, and he goes back to 1. So I can change all of these parameters, Set Master to Default, and he goes back to default. And let's see if our Set All to Default works as well. So Set All to Default is going to find this button and press it. So Set All to Default, and that works great. So to add this functionality to the rest of our parameters, we just have to do a couple of things. We just have to make a button inside each of our actions folders. So for the left arm, the left hand, left leg, left foot, etc. And then call SetAllToDefaults. And then it'll set all of those. And then add, in this case, the left hand button. So I can uncomment that. So once I've made this set left hand default button, now when I set all to default, I can find it and press it. So I'm going to do that, all of these sections, and then I'll come back and I'll show you what the result is. All right, I've gone through and created buttons for all of our parameters. And each of those buttons is running a callback script going to our Python module and running SetAllToDefault. And then this is SetAllToDefault, which we went through before. And then on the master tab, SetAllToDefault is running this SetAllToDefault, which is, as I said earlier, it's looking for all the buttons. So I've added variables that hold all of these parameters, and then it's pressing those buttons. So when I click SetAllToDefaults, it's as if I went through to spine, set, head, neck, left arm, left hand, all the way through. And we can see, make some changes to our hand. And then if we set left hand to default, they pop back to default. I'm going to add another script using the exact same procedure. So I'm going to add another action button, and I'm going to add another script in here. And that script is going to set a key for each of these. And then the master one is going to have a key all. So I'll come back and we'll look over that script. All right, I've gone through and I've added a key all to the master tab, as well as a key master. And then I've gone through to each of the different sections of our rig and added a key button. So for instance, the left arm, we can key it. The left hand, we can key it. Right foot, right leg. So when I hit one of these, all of those parameters that have Autoscope on have been keyed. So our FK-IK blend, twist space, and then the transform parameters here. And also, if you look, I don't have any keys anywhere else. I can go to the master tab and I can say key all. So now we have keys. Whoops, those guys might not have Autoscope on. I'll have to check that. But you can see all the way through, all of our fingers, all of our foot parameters have been keyed just with that one button. So that's very, very fast when you're blocking out scenes and posing your character very quickly, and you just need to key everything to get those poses done. So the script that we did for SetAllToDefault would find each of those buttons and then press those buttons and then run this script. And then the SetKeyAll button does the same thing. It finds the SetKey button for each of our sections, and then it runs press button on that button. And then the script that it runs is very similar to our SetToDefaults. So again, this section up here, it creates a keyframe. This section finds the button, finds its containing folder, and then the folder that contains that, and finds all the parm templates. Then again, we make that list of parameter templates. And then down here, we check to see if it's auto-scoped. And if it is, then we set a key for that parameter at that frame. So pretty simple. And as I've said, you can pile a lot of stuff into the Python module. You can have dozens of scripts that do all the kinds of things that you might want to do when you're animating a character. So I can just walk through to show you how to create a button, how to create the Python module, how to write code in that module, and how to properly access that code. The last scripts that we'll talk about in this series will be our match-IK and match-FK scripts. The specific details of these scripts are a little bit outside the scope of this introductory series, but we'll walk through it and you'll get a good sense of what they're doing. And when you get this asset later on, you can step through it line by line and see what's happening. So to start, just as I've done with all the other scripts, I've added a couple of buttons here. One is left arm match IK. And what this will do is it will take the FK controls and set their parameters so that they match the IK solution. And then the other one is left arm match FK. And these will take the IK controls and match them to the FK solution. So for each of these buttons that I've added, we're adding a callback script, and we're ensuring that it's set to Python. And then again, calling who pwd HDA module, so that will be the Python module in the HDA itself. Then I'm calling the actual method. I'm passing kwargs, but I'm also passing, in the case of the arm, this string arm. And when I add them to the legs, I'll add, instead of arm, it'll say leg. That way we can have one script that can do both our arm and our leg. And all we have to do is differentiate them with this added argument. So that's just like all the other scripts. If we go to our script tab in our Python module, let's look at what the match IK script is doing. So we're receiving the kwarg, but we're also receiving this type. And that again is, in this case, arm. So first what it does is it uses the script parm from kwargs to find out if this is a left-hand side or a right-hand side. Then it sets this variable called side. And then in this section, I'm just gathering the things that I need. Specifically, I'm gathering the bones and controls of the FK solution. And then if the type is leg, I do this stuff or not. In this case of the arm, I just do this. But if it's leg, I'll go down and do this. But what I really want to do is, I want to find the IK solver for this, in this case, let's say it's the left arm. I want to find the solver for the left arm, and I want to get the rotation channels that the IK solver is producing, and then I want to put those values into the FK controls. And then here I'm checking if the auto shoulder is not 0. And if it is being used, then I'm going to set it to 0, just so that this auto shoulder business doesn't interfere with the matching of the IK solution. So that's pretty much it. It looks like a lot, but really we're just gathering the things that we need. And then depending on whether it's an arm or a leg, we're doing some things. And really it's this solver. We're getting this information, which is the rotations of those bones. And then we're setting those rotations into the IK or FK controls. So again, when you get this asset, you can step through this really carefully and find out just how it's being built. And then for our match FK, we want to take the IK solution and move those controls into the position so that they will result in the FK. So here, this one is a little more complicated, but it's basically doing the same thing. I'm finding out whether I'm an arm or a leg. I'm finding out whether I'm on the left side or the right side. And then I'm gathering the things that I need, specifically the bones, the IK control, the twist control. And then I'm finding out where the FK bones are and moving the IK control, twist control to the positions that would result in those bone orientations. And that's what all of this is about down here. So as I've said, it's a little bit out of the scope of this introductory tutorial, but I wanted to show you that they're pretty straightforward. And nowadays they're pretty much expected on a rig to have this ability to match IK and FK just with the click of a button. If you're interested and adventurous, you can go through and you can extract out of these scripts some really good ideas for other types of controls that you might want to add to your rig. So that's it for all of our scripts, and our rig is done. All that's left to do is to ensure that we save the node type to put all of our changes into our asset. And then right-click Match Current Definition, and that will lock up our asset, which will prevent people from making any changes in here. And now this asset can be distributed because it exists on disk. You can see that it's just that actual file. So I can pass that around and make it available to as many people as I want. I can email it to them or whatever. And all of its functionality is contained inside because we've promoted all of the things that we want an animator to use up to this top level. So that's it for this first rigging series. I hope you've found it interesting and informative. And as always, if you have any questions or better ideas, ways of doing these things better, don't hesitate to give us that kind of feedback, either through our support channels or on the forum. I'll be happy to hear from you and have conversations about all of this. So thank you very much.